Hi, I'm Charlie Willson. Welcome to ThinkTech, raising public awareness about technology, globalism, energy, and diversification. Today's show is on the future of education and education for the future. I have two guests with me today. Dr. Christine Hansen has degrees in half a dozen different academic disciplines and has teaching or administrative experience with numerous local universities, including HPU, UH Manoa, Chaminade, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, Leeward Community College, and others. She has a long-standing interest in the future of education. To her left, we have Dodi Rose, who has been involved in education most of her lifetime, starting with a degree in music education from UH Manoa and going on to teach music education in public and private schools. After becoming frustrated with traditional teaching methods in the public and private schools, she went on to start exploring new methods that would actually help children get past their blocks and be more prepared to learn. Dodi is currently working to get Transition University up and running as a template for hands-on practical sustainability education. Welcome to ThinkTech.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Today we're going to take a broad spectrum approach, and we're going to be looking at both public and private education, both K-12 and higher education and lifelong learning. We are going to start with a couple of topics here. We're going to be looking at the purposes of education, the ecology of education, the economics of education, and the changing face of information delivery. In general, when we talk about the purposes of education, we're talking generally about preparation for life, cultural literacy, being able to get and hold a job, taking care of oneself through the life cycle, being a good citizen, and contributing something to the evolution of humanity. And this has been talked about by numerous people in the past, John Dewey, Thomas Jefferson, folks like that. So, in starting this, are we doing a good job at these? Are we preparing students for the world that they're going to live in, or are we preparing them for the world that existed in our parents' generation and before?
I think that's an excellent question, and education does tend to always be behind the times, and part of the reason for that is simply the fact that textbooks have such an informational delay. So by the time information gets into a textbook and actually gets distributed to classrooms, it might be 10 years down the road from the time that information was on the cutting edge. So there's always a delay, and I guess my brief answer to your question would be no, we're not doing a good job.
I agree with you because especially now that technology is going so fast, and even iPhones and all these computers, all these technological advances, they just keep going faster and faster and littler, and it's hard to keep up even with that. So, I think schools try to do their best to keep up, but they also are holding on to this old paradigm that does not work anymore. And so I think that we need to explore new ways of helping kids really get past all this stuff that just bogs them down and really get into a place where they can feel empowered and excited about what they're learning, and really be able to move forward with their purpose on this planet.
If we look at the world of the future here, what's coming down the road? If we look at we may be expanding into the future. We may have a growth economy for a period. We may be going through a period of contraction. We don't know exactly what the future brings. We know that we are running out of resources, that there will be changes. What kind of preparation do we really want for our kids, or not just our kids, in terms of lifelong learning for people to be participating members of society?
I would like to see people become more empowered, and I think Dodi was just talking about empowerment in a different sense, but people have become very dependent on a system. So They're delivered education by, usually still through a textbook. That's changing through the internet these days. But in order for people to really be able to respond to their environment, I believe they have to be resilient. They have to have a set of tools that they can use according to the needs of the situation. And we're not really preparing people very well for that, especially when we put a focus on specialization. So what we're doing is we're turning out people who are sometimes very specialized in a particular narrow field. But whether those people can actually adapt to the problems of the world, I think, is very unclear.
Well, I really feel like there are some radical departures from the past, and it could be that we get ourselves, excuse me, into a corner where we may have to give up oil at some point. And so living here on this island, what would happen if the boat stopped coming or the plane stopped coming? We would have to equip people with skills, basic skills, computers wouldn't be so helpful, We need to know how to, excuse me, how to grow our own food, how to preserve our own food, and how to live in a more connected way with other people and with nature.
We're talking about a radically different skill set here.
Yeah.
Okay, and because we don't know exactly what's coming down the road, we kind of need a broad spectrum preparation. We need people to be able to take the jobs that exist, but a lot of education has been oriented to making people fit into the system as it exists, and it really doesn't consider what is likely to happen in the future and the changes that are likely to be coming. We will have to adapt to a period of less dependence on fossil fuels. We know that. We don't know exactly when. We can take a good guess that, our grandchildren for certain are going to have to be able to live in a very different world, and perhaps an extremely different world over time as we have to live within the energy receipts of the sun.
Mm-hmm.
What would we like to see as an ideal educational system to consider these factors and to prepare people for whatever comes down the road, and to be adaptive?
Well, one thing that concerns me is that I think the way that we're preparing is sometimes exactly the wrong way. So buzzwords that are still very widespread in the educational system have to do with globalization, people teaching supply chain management as if those long supply chains are always going to be there. And this doesn't seem to be very good preparation for a future in which probably energy resources are going to be more expensive. It isn't going to be so easy, as you were saying, to bring in that material by container ship. So we're going to have to know how to manage our own systems better. We're going to have that requires knowledge. And I think we've divorced ourselves really from the type of knowledge that we really need to have, because knowledge from a textbook is not always the type of knowledge that's needed to solve those kinds of real world problems.
And I think that if we can start preparing now for those times, then we can be more prepared. We can actually be equipped to continue to have electricity from other sources. Third world countries are getting their the cells, all the solar cells, and they're like technologically becoming more advanced in terms of how they're getting their energy than we are. And so I think we really need to look at preparing ourselves, as I said, and then preparing ourselves also to be more sustainable, more self-sufficient, so that we can still have our computers, and yet we are more self-sufficient in terms of not depending on things coming to us. It's going to be take a lot of thought to really organize ourselves so that if anything happens, and we don't know what's going to happen, it's like this big what if. So we do need to be prepared on a lot of different fronts in a lot of different ways.
And realistically, if you turn the clock back 150 years, we're talking about a period where there were no fossil fuels in general. We were talking about a period where in pre-contact times, we supported a population that at least on the islands other than Oahu, we were able to support people just on the solar receipts, the energy receipts of the sun. We were able to grow the food for everybody who lives here, harvest the seas. We did not need external fossil fuel energy resources. So it's doable. You know, it will be tight for Oahu, but it's doable.
Well, it was doable with a different population level. So I think one of the things that we also have to take into consideration is that the population of the Earth tends to ratchet up. Whenever you input energy and you make people dependent on that energy, you ratchet up the population levels, and then people become dependent at that new level. And so this was a point that was made by Ponting, you know, in Green History of the World, that he says that's really the history of all civilization from the time of the first cities, you know. And so the problem is, yes, you might be able to have energy, you might be able to do the things that you need to do, but can you do it for that number of people? Can you sustain that level of population? And I think the other thing that Dodi mentioned was, she mentioned the planning that would be necessary for that, the long-term planning. And that's what I'm not seeing, is that, you know, if you look at the way that people do planning for the future, it seems to be always on a very short time horizon. And what we really need to do is have much longer time horizons that are not so much economically driven by the short-term bottom line, but driven by a longer vision for sustainability.
Right, looking out 50 or 100 years and not 5 years
Exactly.
into the future.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I totally agree with that. And as we look to other models, you know, if we can be open to the innovations of other countries, I think that would be wonderful. You know, whereas right now, you know, I mean, America used to be a leader in so many different things, and now America's lagging behind in so many things, because I think a lot of people, I don't know if I want to say who, but maybe leaders, or they're stuck in the old ways, especially when it comes to fossil fuels. They're really attached to making their money with fossil fuels.
I think that's so right. One of the reasons for that is a lack of flexibility in the thinking, a lack of imagination. And that goes right back to education. That what are we doing when we're educating people? We're essentially fossilizing the thinking system. We're saying, here, think this, you know, and specialize in this. We're not bringing out people's creativity. We're not bringing out the flexible side of their thinking that needs to be there to solve those kinds of problems.
And we're not considering the possibilities that the world as we know it right now is not the world we're going to be living in even a few years from now. That things can change fairly radically. And that the veneer of civilization is relatively thin here, as we've seen when we have natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, as we see in the banking sector when a few folks making risky bets here can basically collapse the global economy, and then a lot of things changes for a lot of people. You know, people are out of jobs because companies are cutting back. You know, they may not be able to pay off their mortgages. Now we have global systemic problems that go far beyond the small events that triggered that.
And the other thing that worries me a little bit is the fact that the system is now so interdependent and homogeneic, I suppose. You know, that it used to be that when you had isolated pockets in the world, at least you had a few parallel systems going at one time. So if there was some massive thing that happened in one of those systems, then you would have parallel systems where something else might be able to bounce back and solve the problem. But when we're all so interconnected, I think that that does introduce a kind of mutual dependency that isn't always the kind of mutual dependency that we would want. So there's a kind of mutual dependency that we would definitely want, but there's also a kind of mutual dependency that in a way makes us very vulnerable to some kind of a perturbation in that system.
A web of dependencies that is particularly fragile. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. We're going to take a break here, and we'll be right back with you in just a few moments.
So you want to just come in on that?
Hi, we're back from our break. We're talking about the future of education and education for the future, and my guests are Dr. Christine Hansen and Dodi Rose, both educators of long standing in Hawaii, and we've been talking about, well, before we went to break, we were talking about the network of interdependencies in global systems here. Basically, we have a situation where in the natural environment, most every creature, most every business exploits their environment to the point of maximum efficiency. But in approaching their maximum efficiency, we end up being very close to the critical ragged edge where things can go over the cliff pretty quickly. And that introduces a new notion to education. How do we train people? How do we educate people in a way that they are prepared to deal with a certain amount of uncertainty in their lives? The fact that tomorrow may not be the same as yesterday.
Well, I think the best way to do that is to allow people to become less dependent in their education. So instead of being told what to think, a lot of traditional education, a student is given curriculum and told to regurgitate that curriculum back, or the student is told that this is what they have to learn. These are the learning outcomes. But in real life, I don't think that real life is outcomes driven. So in real life, you're going to be presented with problems that don't necessarily fit that paradigm, and you have to have the flexibility in your response to be able to deal with that. So what I would say is that the idea of the top-down, outcomes-driven education is not going to produce the kind of people that we want. And while I do think it's important for educational institutions to be accountable, certainly I don't think they should be getting public funds without some accountability. At the same time, I don't think that the type of accountability that we're instilling with that outcomes-driven education is necessarily the best type of accountability that we really want. So what we need is to consider it as a system where rather than having this top-down structure where administration is kind of driving the outcomes-based education, I think it's important to consider the educational system as having a number of roles. It has the instructor role, it has the student role, has the staff role, and the administrator role. And these should all be considered when deciding how to make this a workable system. And so I think at the moment there's too much emphasis really on administration being able to document outcomes at the expense of producing these resilient thinkers that we would really like to produce.
Just to clarify here, when we talk about outcomes-based education here, are you referring primarily to teaching to the tests so that we will score better, our classrooms will score better in standardized tests, rather than teaching people real world type skills where they actually learn to do things like grow a garden, fix a tire, etc.?
I think teaching real world skills is important, but also being able to present people with more unknowns, to say to people, here's a problem, you find a way to solve it, rather than to say to somebody, here's how you solve the problem. I think people are being told too much how to go about doing their education. And what we really want to do, if we want to produce problem solvers, we want to be able to say to somebody, solve the problem as best you can, in your own way, but also bringing in these other skills that you see around you so that you can approach the problem in the best possible way. But instead, I think we have sometimes the tendency to tell people, here's how the problem should be solved, go and solve. And then ironically in graduate school, sometimes we say, now forget all that, and then go solve the problem in an original way after however many years of doing the opposite. So.
Well, I also think that we're so isolated in our thinking that we end up not getting a very well-rounded education. And that term has been around a lot, but now it needs to be more based on reality. And it's a tricky thing to balance, but we've got to learn how to balance it, because we're competing with other countries now in terms of math scores, all this, all these other countries are getting better math scores, and so we're competing with that. Yet if we isolate ourselves too much on just the math and the science, and we don't have that reality base, and then if we need to switch gears, people are going to be lost, especially, you know, there's so much time that children spend now behind the computer screen, the TV screen. They're not going out in nature. They're not connecting with that very energy that sustains us, Mother Earth, nature, and that disconnection is, I think, part of the problem, why we're just keep going down this road of isolating our whole way of thinking, you know, and we're thinking so much that we're not in our bodies, we're not walking on the earth in a good way that will make it possible to walk on the earth in a good way in the future. So we have to learn how to balance that.
You're talking about sustainability education,
Yeah,
basically,
yeah.
and
You know, and connecting with those skills that will help us maintain the earth in a livable way for the future.
right. You're
Yeah.
basically talking about a former skill set that we have lost
Yeah,
over time.
exactly.
Yeah.
We have
Grandparents.
skill sets that were known by most everybody. I won't say everybody, perhaps not in the very large cities, but most people go back 100, 150 years prior,
Yeah.
knew how to grow a garden. They knew how to take care of their own transport needs. They knew how to do basic tool making and things like that. So we're talking about perhaps skills for adaptability, for resilience. We're talking about systems in general that would be less brittle, because we live in a system right now which is relatively brittle. If something happens, if the supply chain breaks, if we don't get oil in for energy, all of a sudden, when the power goes down, we can't pump gas, we can't pump water into people's houses,
Yeah.
which means you can't flush your toilets, which means your internet is down, your TV is down, except when it has emergency power, etc. Well, your TV will be down. You won't have emergency power. You might have a battery-powered radio that works. But we're talking about a future where we're facing a certain amount of brittleness. And so we want flexible systems. Is that correct? Is that
And
what
I
you're
think-
saying?
I think, you know, you're making an excellent point when you talk about the fact that knowledge is not just book learning knowledge. We tend to always hear that there's so much more information in our society today than there used to be. And yet, you know, what you brought up is that actually there's a lot of forms of information that are being lost. So as an example, I would say some of the world's languages where, you know, that that whole base of linguistic knowledge being lost, you know, that way of responding to the world. And there's lots of other examples in terms of growing a garden and the things that you brought up. Those are forms of knowledge that are increasingly giving way to you know, video games, to computer. Now, I love computers. I'm on my computer all the time, so I'm not knocking computers. But I do think that looking at things from the point of view of programming is a different skill set from the skills that it takes to write an epic poem, you know, or to compose a great piece of music. And increasingly what concerns me is that I think our society is moving toward a very select number of these skills, and we're having more and more in terms of quantity of these, but are we really spanning the whole range of things that people used to do? Increasingly in schools, there's less and less emphasis on the arts and more emphasis on STEM, which again, you know, I'm a big advocate of STEM education, but not at the expense of something else. So
You wanna
that
define that.
repertoire, that range of skills, I think is being diminished, and we're confusing quantity of information with range of information.
Just for our viewers who are not familiar, would you tell us what STEM education is about?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, STEM education, math and science education.
Okay.
Yeah,
So you're arguing basically for a more rounded education.
that's right.
For want of a better term, a left brain and a right brain education. So you're developing complete people, and not just focusing on specific vocational requirements. Okay?
Exactly.
And then the other side of the coin being, what do we have to do when the rubber band breaks as well?
Well, I think that, like I said before, we have to be prepared. you know, we really, I've seen in the schools there are classes now that people are teaching classes on, you know, the idea of what global warming is, and you know what's really happening. Why is this happening to our forests, you know, and to our waters, and you know we really need to impress upon everyone, but especially the children who are in school now, this is serious. Because I've seen in these classes that they're taking these, you know, now they're electives and they can take this and that. It's like they get it, but they don't really get it. It's like they don't, it's like a fairy tale or something. They're not really getting that this could really be happening right now. And I don't know what it's going to take for them to really understand that they need to, they're the ones who are going to take over when we're not here.
Well,
You're saying there's a disconnect, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, you can see that line being blurred, I think, in a lot of video game exercises, that increasingly warfare, for example, looks like a video game, you know. So what is real and what is not real? You know, is this a death or a target? Is this a game or a reality? It's difficult for people sometimes to figure that out. And you know, Dodi mentioned being sort of divorced from the natural world, which I think is, you know, when we're immersed in the natural world, when we can see the cycles of life going on around us, and like you say, plant our feet on the ground, feel the reality of things, that is different from when we're sitting in front of a screen immersed in, you know, some kind of a virtual reality all day long. And I think increasingly those lines are being blurred. And I think part of that is experiential, that when a person can experience what it means to participate in real life, then the person will also lay down those brain pathways or whatever it is, you know, that happens in the brain. Whereas I don't think that a person who's passively receiving knowledge and is told, you know, learn this and then regurgitate it on a test is able to respond in that way. So I think the passive consumer of information in a school tends to become the person who isn't really engaged with reality.
That's a really good point.
I've actually seen some high school programs that have these amazing classes where you can learn how to build a pottery stove, you know, like an oven and a stove, kind of like a, you know, a pizza oven, but it's like something you could cook anything in, and how to build a straw bale house, and the kids just eat it up. And you can see the difference, whereas before the children are just kind of like walking around, they're not animated, they're just kind of going through their day, and this is when they start really feeling disconnected, and once they start seeing that they can be a part of this renaissance, and they get totally excited about it, they completely change and they become alive again.
Basically, what you're saying, if I get it right, is you're engaging the student. So instead of becoming the passive recipient of education from somebody standing up there and lecturing at them or saying, take this home and read it, you're now giving them a project and they have to solve a problem.
Yeah.
They have to do something for themselves and then get that sense of mastery from it, which I think is important in individual growth.
That mastery is something that when you master a subject, that's great too, but there's nothing like mastering this hands-on, you know, even creating a garden, you know, when you've got your hands in it rather than your mind.
That's a
you know.
big, that's
You're
a big.
engaging your mind too, but it's like a whole body mind thing,
Yeah.
as opposed to just engaging the mind in itself. And I also have to say, it also presents something to children that they're not just being taught to be consumers of things.
Right.
That they
We're
can
going to
actually
take a break with that, and we'll come back to that in just a moment here. That gives us a good piece to come back on.
Okay.
So we're going to take a few breaks. We're talking about the future of education and education for the future, and we'll be right back. ThinkTech TV. We're coming back from break now. We're discussing the future of education and education for the future. My two guests are Dodi Rose and Dr. Christine Hansen, and we've been kicking around the notion of schooling alternatives where we get people involved in projects and a sense of mastery rather than the simple sitting there and digesting information that's delivered one way.
And I loved what you were saying about the projects, because I think that each individual student has different talents, and so in a traditional classroom, the classroom is geared from the teacher's point of view, for the teacher's convenience. Here's the curriculum, and everyone gets the same curriculum. But what you're talking about is something that's geared more towards the student's individual talents, it sounds like.
And these are talents that I think just about anybody can develop. They're basic talents. It's not like music, or artwork, it's basic. And I have to say that even now there are, in Europe, a lot of pretty amazing schools cropping up, like the Forest Kindergarten in Germany, where the preschoolers are allowed to go out in the forest and play all day and work on their little projects, and they really learn how to work with nature, and they let nature teach them. And then there's even schools in Russia, the tech schools, where they are allowed to create their own learning map. They build their own schools, they build their own curriculum, and they actually keep all of the cultural songs and artwork, everything intact in these schools by putting the artwork into the school, and they're doing the artwork while they're building, and
Well,
it's so integrated that
I think a Hawaiian immersion school would be a little bit along those lines.
Yeah.
That there you're preserving
Yeah.
aspects of the Hawaiian culture that would have been
Right.
lost if it weren't for those immersion schools. And
That's
they've
true.
really done so much to preserve Hawaiian culture. So
Also, going back to your earlier point about working together as a team, collaborative learning, I see that as a big advantage also in breaking, well, I don't want to say breaking the existing model, but one of the key things about school systems that provides real world skills that you'll need in the future is a sense of working as part of a team, being part of a deliberative process, making decisions as a group, not in a way that you're knocking heads and fighting and see who gets to be the leader, but sitting down, collaborating, and then going out and finding the information you need to do whatever the project requires. So.
yeah. And I think that's something that's sorely lacking in our society right now, that we do live in a very competitive society, and there tends to be, I think, a lot of narcissism. People are incapable of really looking at the group benefit and saying, I'm going to make my contribution for the whole, for everybody, rather than for myself. And we're encouraged from a very young age not to do that. We're encouraged to be very individualistic. And I think this does lead to a lot of not just knocking of heads, but loss of inner resources on the part of people, because when somebody's discouraged, they're not making their full contribution. And I have this sort of a wild idea of a world in which everybody's contribution could somehow be made. Everybody's inherent gifts could somehow come to the fore. And I've often thought what an amazing world that would be. But in most cases, I'm afraid from what I've seen, the students are not able to make those contributions. And it comes from a variety of factors. It comes from economic factors. It comes from some simple facts about what types of employment are available, which is partly an economic factor, but not completely. And it comes from competition factors, that oftentimes there's people that don't want other people to succeed, or they want to be, top dog or whatever. So it's a system that isn't necessarily allowing those contributions to come forth. And wouldn't it be a different world if everything that was inside a person, all of the gifts that were there, could come forth and contribute? I think it would be a different world.
I think that's possible. I totally have seen that work in certain schools, and it's just exciting. And there's the old model of, you know, the marketing and the competition that you have to step on someone else to get ahead. And that's going to fall apart. I don't think that's going to actually be able to survive if we want to survive. We are going to have to get a sense of community, contribution, work together, and it's exciting and it's way more fun than, like, you know, having this kind of like, oh, I got to compete against all these people. And so I really feel like that is going to be part of the future, is the cooperation. And it might take a little bit of a scare to get us to that point. Something scary happened, but you know, hopefully it won't be too scary, and it'll just get people right on board.
I agree. The direction that we need to be looking at in the future is more cooperative model, because people succeed when they cooperate, when they're able to work together as a group, when they're able to make group decisions, not based on one-upsmanship and who's going to be top dog.
And kindness and compassion just seem to have disappeared sometimes from our world. You know, I think maybe that's a little bit of an extreme statement, but certainly kindness and compassion could be much stronger than they are. And a lot of times I think that does shut people down. That, in other words, if you were to take a classroom, there's probably a certain number of students that are very vocal, very aggressive. And then there's going to be a certain number of students who are relatively shy, who aren't going to speak up. You know, when those students are thrown into a dynamic where it's a sort of brutal competition and, you know, I'm going to get mine and I don't care about what happens to anybody else, then those students who are sitting in the corner, I think, get lost in the maelstrom, and they end up, you know, not really advancing in the way that they could in society. So I believe that, you know, compassion and kindness are important. And I think they're often confused with weakness. A lot of people believe that, you know, if you're kind, then that's not strength. But kindness and compassion are strength. And I think that's something we really need to teach our children and our young adults, too.
I think that's very important.
I'm so glad you said that, because I've seen in different circles of organizations throughout the world that are actually starting to focus now on SEVA, you know, doing your community work. And it just, there's just nothing like it. You know, it brings out something in you. It wakes something up, or it brings you alive when you actually care for someone else rather than consider them. And it helps us be connected like that. You know, there is that separation when we consider other people as competition. But that will fall away when we consider that we have to work together and we have to be connected. And then there's this whole that's more than the sum of its parts that gets created when people are working together, and it just starts snowballing, or, you know, it grows, and other people get that contagious feeling, and it just gathers people,
and to an extent, we have to consider that one of the problems with the existing system is that kids learn a lot of inappropriate behaviors in schools. There's a lot of hazing, bullying. There's a lot of focus on things that have absolutely nothing to do with learning, and have to do with just promotion of inappropriate behavior among themselves, and getting away from that, I think, is a good thing. I'd also like to look at a little bit about how we transition out of the existing model. In the future, there's a couple of things we're going to have to look at. One of those is the cost of education, because education has gotten very costly, both in terms of, well, you can look at existing expenses, the cost of infrastructure, the cost of providing the energy for lighting. For some schools, it's air conditioning, the cost of teacher pensions, for retirement, for healthcare costs, things like this. These things add up. Thermodynamically, it's expensive when you start looking at busing kids to school, and there's so many kids now riding buses or cars or whatever.
I think there's a flip side to that, though, and that is that if you're talking about brick and mortar expenses, of
Mhm.
course, the internet education revolution has really changed that. So there are lots of schools that have no brick and mortar. They have
Mhm.
very limited brick and mortar, and so there is a way in which education is being done with much less overhead coming from that part of the educational process. I think the problem with those types of educational programs is that they're often not accredited. Some are not accredited. Some are accredited but don't necessarily suit the needs of all learners because not everyone can learn in an online format. But how are employers going to validate that type of learning? So, in other words, let's say that I've done some sort of online courses and it's not from an accredited institution. What are those actually worth in the workplace? I know what they're worth to me personally, but do they have an economic value? How does my employer recognize whether or not those courses are worthwhile? We haven't really worked out a system for that yet, I don't think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as we talk about the transformation here, um, we need to look both at accreditation. We also need to look at the delivery system. Right now, there's a lot of people who are interested in homeschooling, mostly because you can take your kids out of a system which is sometimes dysfunctional, which can be very expensive if you're going to a good school, um, and which has other issues of transport back and forth. Realistically, you can have educational curriculum delivered to wherever you happen to be with a laptop and a desk, and you can take classes there. And probably after our next break, we can come back and talk a little bit about some of the alternatives that are being worked on right now, such as Khan Academy
Khan
and
Academy,
things
yeah.
like that. Um, in in the meantime, homeschooling right now is something that I've seen a lot more interest in, just as a way of separating yourself from um, what many parents consider to be an undesirable situation and getting a little bit more control over the situation. So when we come back from break, let's pick it up and we can talk about Khan Academy and some of the other initiatives. So we're going to take a break. This is Charlie Willson with my guests, Dr. Christine Hansen and Dodi Rose. We're talking about the future of education and education for the future. We'll be right back. Hi, we're back. This is ThinkTech TV. I'm Charlie Willson. I'm with Dodi Rose and Dr. Christine Hansen. And just before we went to break, we were talking about educational alternatives, and in particular, a model that basically turns our existing model of education kind of upside down. It's an initiative called the Khan Academy, and for those of you who want to Google this and look this up a little bit further for more information, it's KHAN Academy, and you can find a very interesting TED Talk on the subject, and I'd start there if you're interested. But in general, Khan Academy it takes teaching and puts that basically on somebody's laptop, so you can take your lesson at home rather than sitting in front of a classroom and having somebody teaching to the general, well, let's say the 80% level in a classroom, try to get 80% involved, and assuming that a few people aren't going to be paying attention or just won't get it. So everybody learns at a different rate. So who wants to pick that one up?
Well, I think Khan Academy is really just the tip of the iceberg, that the whole paradigm of education is changing. And this started really with the internet. Now we also have podcasts being used to deliver education. We have a variety of two-way audiovisual systems that are operating in real time. So we have synchronous and asynchronous education occurring in remote locations. And so I can be in a classroom talking to somebody all the way across the country, or all the way across the world. I can be talking to someone in Malaysia, I can be talking to somebody in India, you know. And this is something that wasn't possible before. So I think in terms of people informing each other on important topics, that that is a wonderful way of doing it, that, you know, people can say, well, here in India right now we're doing this, or here in China right now we're doing this, or here in the United States we're doing this. The problem that I think I mentioned before with those types of experiences is that they're not always accredited. So some are, some aren't. The ones that aren't accredited obviously have some value. And I think increasingly people in other parts of the world are the ones that are having a particular incentive to engage in education like that, because if you're located in an area that's really being lifted up economically, then obviously you're going to want to take advantage of the opportunities to do that. So right now what I'm seeing is I'm seeing a lot of incentives to enroll people from places in Africa, from places in Asia that maybe haven't had that much educational prominence before. And people they're excited about education. They want to get that economic advantage. They want to get that learning that they think is going to help them in life. And that, I think, is one of the wonderful positive things that's happening with education. The problem is really more the way that education's been going in this country. And I think that has a lot to do with economics, that we've allowed education to no longer be a public good, but rather to be an economic commodity. And I think that's a mistake. And I think that's why we're falling behind the rest of the world.
I agree. And the whole world is becoming very small because of the internet, and so there's going to be a lot more sharing and a lot more information and more useful things that are going to be shared on the internet, and it's good to have the accreditation. I don't know how important accreditation is going to be in the future. I think maybe in certain realms, you know, like if you want to go to a really Ivy League school, you know, you'll want to go to accredited school, you know, college or even, you know, elementary school or whatever. But I think that because the whole world is going to be just exploding with information, and a lot of people are not going to be so concerned about, well, whether it's accredited or not. It's just how relevant is the information in getting a job? How relevant is it in helping us become more sustainable, more self-sufficient? I think that's going to take the forefront. And
right now, realistically, taking off from Christine's point, you can have a classroom and you can be interacting with. You don't have to have a classroom which is geographically identified.
Right.
You can have people from around the world who are attending classes with you and discussing with you. But further, if you look at what's done on EDX, for example, here. You have MIT putting their courseware online basically for free. Now, the ability for somebody, and I'm not just talking people in the backwoods in the United States, I'm talking you can be living in Bangladesh here, and you can log on and you can basically attend a class from MIT. Now, you don't get accredited from MIT. For that, you still have to pay for, but you can take the class and you can get a certificate of completion of that class. I was recently in New England and sat and had supper with a family who is homeschooling their daughter. The man is a cancer researcher, and the whole family is a very interesting group, and they're homeschooling their daughter. And she was taking an MIT course through EDX in biology. And I didn't ask her what her age was. I would guess about 14. But here she's leapfrogging past what's available in high school to take something that's of interest to her and picking up the ball and running with it. And I think that that's a model of how education will work in the future. Now, popping back for just a second to Khan Academy. Khan Academy is putting the educational resources at your fingertips on a computer and then allowing you to take tests where if you have not mastered a subject, it figures out what you're missing here and then pulls you back and runs you through the material again, or helps you with additional information and then reports that to the teachers. So this is another way that we're taking the whole model of education and turning it upside down, so that now the teacher time can be used to help the students who are falling behind, and students can go ahead at their own rate, which means that you don't get so bored in class and you don't get lost in class, because you'll be self-paced. How do you think that's going to change education? Do you think that that's the way it's going to happen in the future?
You know, I can give you a really good answer to that, Charlie, because actually, when I was in high school, I had a lot of trouble adapting to the traditional high school system. And it was only when I entered what they had at that time, it was called School Within a School, where they had an alternative paradigm. And for the last 2 years of my high school experience, I was in this School Within a School that allowed me to go at my own pace. That was what first interested me in education. So I think that's the model that we're going to see, that people, when they're given an opportunity to engage the material in their own way, to come to it with their inherent love of a particular subject and their inherent desire to learn more about that, we're going to see people being able to take off with their natural abilities. And there's just been too much top-down control in education. I think we're spending a lot of resources on this, and you know, today people are just bogged down in outcomes, assessing outcomes. It's taking up a lot of teacher time. I'm not sure that it's really producing better education, and yet this is what everyone's telling us is supposed to be the way to create a better educational system.
I've always felt like, you know, when I got my degree, you know, you had to learn how to do the outcomes and figure out your lesson plans based on outcomes, and I always felt like this isn't really relevant, you know? I mean, it's like obscure almost, and I totally agree with you that, you know, this whole way of learning, turning it upside down, wow, that's like, what took us so long to figure that one out? That works so well, and I think that it gets kids to fall in love with something that they normally would not have even been interested in because of the blocks, you know. And as I said before, there's a lot of different things that we can utilize tools we can utilize to help kids overcome blocks too. Like there's something called educational kinesiology, brain gym, where you can, based on movement, clear out blocks, and it's very effective. And you can Google educational kinesiology or brain gym to find out more about that. But it's remarkable. And so you've got all these tools now that are coming out that are just going to, I think, help kids learn everything better. And then if you don't have the competition because you're learning on your own, and I think it's going to raise the bar.
We're coming to the end of our show right now, so we're going to have to wrap it up. For those of you who aren't listening at home who want to look at this further, you can research Khan Academy, Khan Academy. You can look up EDX which is the MIT and Harvard. You can Google Transition University, Dodi's enterprise. But we have to go for now. So this is Charlie Willson for ThinkTech TV with Dr. Christine Hansen, Dodi Rose. We are talking about the future of education, education for the future. And thank you very much for joining us today. And you can look us up at www.thinktech.tv.com. So we hope to see you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.